10 things, most of which are for combat, that there is a reasonable chance that you do not know, simply because the game doesn't teach it to you. And if you have a weirdly obscure tip or fact of your own to share, be sure to let me know in the comments. With that, let's jump right into the facts and tips. Number 1. When you are raised by another player, you are granted the Transcendent buff for 5 seconds. This makes you completely impervious to damage, as well as anything that is applied as a consequence of taking damage. Certain debuffs, including vulnerability stacks, are only applied if the mechanic actually does more than 0 damage. However, this also means that you are not immune to things unrelated to damage, which means, for example, that you still could get hit by knockbacks or die from falling off the arena, or both. The reason a lot of players miss this one is because it is never taught at any point by the game, not even by the raised tooltip, and if you cast anything, including sprint, which you probably will if you are in danger, it disappears prematurely. In these 5 seconds, you're only allowed to walk around, or the buff expires. However, most players when raised will immediately start attacking to be back in the fight, cancelling the effect immediately. The best way to make use of this buff is to wait until you receive some healing before attacking, or at the very least until the buff ends to make it safer for you. If you have ever been raised into immediately dying to another mechanic, this is probably why it might be your own fault. Number 2. A surprising amount of defensive job actions that appear to be intended to be used on yourself can actually be used on other players. The main reason this can be misunderstood is either because the action is strange, it is offered in a strict window where the player typically doesn't care, or it is an action that 90% of the time you're going to be using on yourself anyway. The actions I'm thinking of in particular are Bard's Warden's Paean. Remember, you can remove your debuff or someone else's, and sometimes being selfless is the better choice. Summoner's Rekindle. Yeah, remember, just because you're popping off with the Phoenix Trance, that heal should be used on someone that actually needs it, instead of just dropping it on yourself and wasting it. Gunbreaker's Aurora, although that one was probably more obvious. No, the really obscure ones are Gunbreaker's Heart of Stone and Corundum, and Dark Knight's Oblation and its signature the Blackest Night, or TBN for short. These can all be shared with friends, and especially in the case of Dark Knight, there are actually some tricks where using TBN on someone else can be necessary or at least beneficial. So do make sure to be a bit more selfless when raiding. If you don't need it, maybe someone else does. Number 3. Did you know that Provoke actually does a mind-boggling amount of enmity? Like, on top of placing you on top of the list. To be precise, Provoke first matches your enmity to the highest, and then applies what appears to be over 4,000 potency worth of enmity to the target. Back in Shadowbringers, this was allegedly 2,000, and tests agreed on this, but recent testing suggests it might actually be way more than that now. But even if it was just 2,000 potency, just to shine a light on how much enmity that is, the only other tank actions in the game accessible to normal jobs that even do over 1,000 potency worth of enmity is Gunbreaker's Double Down, simply due to doing a crazy amount of damage, and weirdly, Warrior's Tomahawk, because it has a 7 times enmity multiplier. Here are the other tank's equivalent actions for comparison. What I'm trying to say is that when doing, for example, dungeons, Provoke is an excellent tool to pick up stragglers, but in a raid situation, it is a lot better to save Provoke for when you need to tank switch. Number 4. This one is about macros. If you've ever cast a glance on an average optimized combat macro, it is often very repetitive. The reason for this is that macros play approximately 1 line in the macro per frame in the game, and unlike normal action buttons, don't offer spell queuing, which is the mechanic that causes the game to automatically use an action for you if you press it over half a second before it is actually ready. Adding a lot of repeated lines in a macro is done to sort of mimic this effect, but even if you used every single line in a macro to do something, it would still at best be a quarter of a second. In other words, if you're making a macro for combat, make sure it repeats itself a lot. Number 5. We stay a bit in the macro world, with Mouseover macros and focus target macros. Because of the unreliability of macros due to their lack of spell queuing, I highly advise against using macros for weapon skills and spells, namely actions on the global cooldown, as the slight delay that can occur due to macros can be costly over the course of a fight. On the other hand, most abilities tend to be used within a range of time, which means a slight delay hardly matters unless it is a healer, for example. In particular, cooldowns that require a secondary target for damaging reasons, like Dragoon's Dragon Sight, I highly recommend making a macro for in some way. Either use a Mouseover macro to point your cursor at the target, or alternatively, or if you are on a controller, use a focus target macro, and set your target to use the buff on beforehand. The Mouseover macro also works well with tip number 2 about sharing your defensive buffs, a Mouseover TBN macro for example. Number 6. What in the world are these blue spheres? You might be wondering why they started appearing. Simply put, these are highlighting spots for the Sightseeing Log and, of course, start appearing once you unlock the Sightseeing Log. What do you use them for? Performing a certain emote while standing on the spot will unlock the log in your Sightseeing Log and permanently remove the sphere for you. It also grants some experience, so make sure to do it with a job that isn't max level yet if you can. Take note, however, that all of the A Realm Reborn Zone Sightseeing Log spots both require a specific time of day and a specific weather to be valid, and the spot will not tell you this. The best way to go about it is to look up the answer. The achievement rewards associated with the Sightseeing Log includes a minion and 2 titles. Number 7. Have you ever seen in the chat log that suddenly your mount speed is increased in a specific zone or area? Or perhaps you have seen these riding maps that purport to do the exact same thing? Or perhaps you have heard of the notorious SDS Fenrir store mount that always has the top mount speed in all zones? Well, that sounds very unfair until you realize that these mount speed increases only talk about ground speed. Your flying mount speed is always maxed out from the very start, meaning that once you have unlocked flying in a zone, aside from the completionist itch to get everything maxed and purchased, there is no benefit to acquiring the mount speed increases in such a zone. This means that the only exceptional zones where this matters at all are the zones where you can never fly, like Eureka, Boscia and Zadnor, or zones that have sections where you cannot fly, like Mordona. Obviously, this still means that the SDS Fenrir store mount proposes a very slight advantage only accessible through this mount, but at least it isn't as bad, right? Number 8. Interruptible Spells. Have you ever seen one of these cast bars that appear to very aggressively be calling for your attention? More so than normal cast bars anyway? Well, when you see a cast bar like this that is pulsing and blinking at you, it means that it is interruptible. This means that you can completely prevent the action from happening in the first place by using an interrupting action on it. This means specifically the tank roll action Interject and the ranged physical roll action Headgrace, or my personal favorite, Blue Mage's Flying Sardine. If someone suddenly spat a fish at me, I would probably also be too surprised to finish casting my spell. An addition to this tip is that interrupting the spell later in the cast of course means the enemy wasted more time on the spell that they ultimately aren't going to be allowed to cast. But at the same time, if you instead opt to interrupt it early, it allows players standing in the target area of the spell to ignore the spell instead of having to potentially stop attacking to move out of the way of the spell that you already planned to stop. The question is whether wasting the enemy's time or saving your party's time is more valuable. Number 9. Let's hop into character configuration. In Endwalker, a few absolutely marvelous additions were added to the target section, and there are practically no reasons not to turn them all on. The biggest ones are the auto-target settings. I recommend immediately turning both auto-target according to priority on and enable full auto-target. This means that if your target dies while you're attacking, if you use an attacking action, you will automatically target something to continue attacking. You can use whichever priority you prefer for regular content, but specifically for PvP, I highly recommend closest range, as it allows you to target whoever is giving you a rough time in melee range a lot easier. The second option is only really important for jobs with ground targeted actions. Under the ground targeting settings, turn on limit ring movement to targeting range, and press action twice to execute. The first one means that you won't fail to use your ground targeted action just because your cursor is out of range, and instead it will be placed as close to where you're pointing as possible, which is typically what you wanted in the first place. The second setting is mainly for anyone using hotkeys, which I highly recommend. Instead of having to press the keybind once and then the confirm button, whether that's left click or something else, you simply double tap the keybind for the action. Both of these options make it far easier to weave something like Asylum, Shukuchi or Sacred Soil. And finally, number 10. Let's dive into HUD layout customization. While this menu allows you to freely customize where your UI elements are, several of these UI elements can actually be further customized if you press the small cogwheel next to the Current UI Element drop-down menu. For example, all job gauges have a simplified alternative that, for some jobs, are far superior at actually conveying information, albeit a bit less exciting to look at. A particularly big one is that the status effects bar and the target bar both offer a way to split them into smaller chunks. For example, you can have your buffs for your job and the status effects placed somewhere separate, so you can more easily track something important like Monk's Leaden Fist without glancing at all of your buffs. You could also separate the debuffs on a boss in the same way, allowing you to collect your buffs, your job's debuffs, and your job gauge all in a single location. For some jobs, this can add a huge amount of quality of life, so don't knock it till you try it. That is all of the tips in this video, but I would like to mention that if you want to know more about any of these tips, especially those that have a bit more depth to them, there is a very high chance I have a video going into more detail with them. In fact, if there is a tip related to a particular job action, like Dark Knight's TBN, I almost certainly explain this stuff in more detail with even more advice in the appropriate job guides on my channel. However, for the more general things, you will find some guides in the iCards in the top right or in the description. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, job gauges is actually a feature added in the Stormblood expansion. Before Stormblood, effects that now are associated with the job gauge either simply didn't exist at all yet, or were relegated to be regular buffs in some way or other. For example, warriors generated stacks of a buff with certain actions, and could use Fell Cleave when they had 5 stacks. Fortunately, job features that worked on a strict every X seconds you get a thing type of effect didn't exist yet. But the introduction of Black Mage's polyglots in Stormblood suggests that the job gauges were specifically considered a way to introduce such types of mechanics to a job.